There was a version of Britain where you knew every face on your street. Not because you were especially friendly, because you simply had no choice. The butcher knew your name, your usual order, and probably more about your family's business than your own mother did. The grocer kept a slate under the counter for families who were short that week. No questions asked, no interest charged, just the quiet understanding that you'd settle up on payday. You could walk from one end of the high street to the other and have your entire life handled before lunch. Bread from the baker, meat from the butcher, a new collar stitched onto your good shirt by the tailor 2 doors down, a seat at the local picture house on a Saturday night, with the usherette who'd known you since you were in short trousers, all of it within a few hundred yards. All of it built up over generations, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, shop by shop, and then in the space of roughly 15 years it was gone. Not faded away gently, not nudged aside by the internet, because the internet didn't exist yet, not even as an idea in anyone's head. Bulldozed, deliberately, on purpose, by the very people whose job it was to protect it. This isn't a story about online shopping killing the high street. That story comes much later, decades later, and frankly it gets told often enough already. This is about something that happened first, something far less discussed, something that did more lasting damage in roughly 10 years than Amazon has managed in 20. This is about a decision. One decision, made quietly in council chambers and government offices, dressed up in the comforting language of progress and modernization, that tore the heart out of British town centres before most of today's pensioners had even finished school. You won't find this story in most of the nostalgia videos floating around online. They'll show you the cobbled high street, the striped awnings, the men in flat caps queuing patiently for their Saturday joint of meat. They'll let you feel warm and wistful about a Britain that no longer exists. But almost nobody tells you what actually happened to that high street. Who signed the order, who profited from it, and why, by the time anyone fully understood what was happening, it was already far too late to stop it. Stick with me through this one, because by the end you're going to look at every concrete shopping center in this country completely differently. You're going to understand why so many British towns feel like they're wearing a mask that doesn't quite fit their own face. And you might just recognize your own childhood high street in a way you never expected to. Let's go back to where this actually began. Not with a wrecking ball swinging into a shop front. With a report. A government report that almost nobody in the general public ever read cover to cover, but one that quietly rewrote the rulebook for every town centre in the country, and gave councils a justification they had been quietly hoping for. In November of 1963, the document landed on the desks of members of Parliament with a title that sounded almost deliberately boring: Traffic in Towns. It became known simply as the Buchanan Report, named after the man who led the study, a planner and civil engineer called Colin Buchanan. The government had asked him a fairly straightforward question. Britain was about to become a genuine car-owning nation, with vehicle numbers projected to climb into the tens of millions within a few decades. What exactly were they going to do about it? Buchanan's answer was not boring in the slightest. He warned that the motor car, left completely unchecked, would choke the life out of every historic town in the country, turning ancient streets never designed for traffic into permanent grinding congestion. So far, this was a reasonable, even prescient warning. But his proposed solution is where things became dangerous in practice. He argued that pedestrians and vehicles needed to be physically separated from one another. Streets needed to be carved into what he called primary roads, where cars took absolute precedence, and environmental areas, where people could walk free from danger and fumes. On paper this sounded humane, even forward-thinking. In practice it handed councils across Britain the perfect government-stamped justification to demolish almost anything they wanted, provided they could frame it as traffic management. And here's the part that should make your blood boil just a little. Buchanan himself never instructed anyone to flatten entire town centers. His actual report was more nuanced than that, full of careful caveats about cost, feasibility, and the importance of public transport. But councils across the country took the headline and quietly ignored the fine print. Traffic in towns became less of a technical planning document and more of an unofficial permission slip, a way to dress up demolition as inevitable progress, and progress as something no decent, forward-thinking town could possibly say no to without looking backward and embarrassing. Within a remarkably short space of time, the conversation in town halls across England shifted entirely. It stopped being "should we redevelop the centre?" and quickly became "how fast can we redevelop the centre, and who's paying for it?" And waiting in the wings, with deep pockets and an appetite for exactly this kind of opportunity, were men who had already been quietly buying up land in British town centres for the better part of a decade. Two of them in particular would go on to reshape more British high streets than almost anyone else in the country's entire history. Their names rarely come up at dinner parties today. But if you grew up anywhere near a town centre in the 1960s or 70s, you almost certainly knew their work intimately. You simply didn't know their names. Their idea had a brand name, and that brand name still makes people of a certain age wince when they hear it. Even now, more than half a century later, the brand name was Arndale. The men behind it were Arnold Hagenbach, who had built his fortune through a chain of bakery shops, and Sam Chippendale, an estate agent with a famously sharp eye for undervalued town centre land. Together in the early 1950s, they formed the Arndale Property Trust. Britain's town centres were full of crowded Victorian buildings, narrow winding streets, and shops that modern retailers increasingly found impossible to operate within. So why not buy up that land, clear it completely, and build something purpose-made for contemporary shopping, all under one roof, sheltered from the British weather? The very first Arndale Centre opened its doors in Jarrow, County Durham, in 1961. It was modest by later standards, a relatively small covered precinct, but it proved the model worked, and worked extremely well, for the people putting up the money. Soon, Arndale centres began appearing across the industrial north and well beyond it, multiplying year after year. Leeds got one in 1967, the very first covered Arndale centre in the country. Designed by an architect named John Poulson, a name we will return to shortly, and for reasons that have nothing to do with architecture. Nelson followed, Stretford followed, Bolton followed, Bradford followed, Doncaster followed. Town after town, the same essential pattern repeated itself almost identically, like a template being stamped across the map of industrial England. Here's where you need to pay especially close attention, because this is the part most nostalgia content conveniently skips entirely. These weren't small, organic extensions bolted onto existing high streets. They required wholesale demolition of entire historic shopping districts, sometimes whole neighborhoods, often built up patiently over 100 years or more by generations of working families. And they certainly weren't funded by plucky local entrepreneurs scraping together savings. They were backed by some of the biggest institutional money in the entire country. The Prudential Assurance Company, one of Britain's largest insurers, poured enormous capital into these schemes, working hand in hand with local councils who supplied the planning permissions. Crucially, the compulsory purchase orders needed to force out existing landowners and long-standing shopkeepers who had no interest in selling. Think about that for a moment, because it matters enormously to understanding what actually happened. A family that had run a draper's shop on the same street corner since before the First World War could suddenly find itself served with official notice that the council was taking the land, with compensation set according to government formulas, not through any genuine negotiation. Their grandfather's shop, gone. Their father's shop, gone. Replaced by a covered shopping mall designed by an architect who had very possibly never set foot in the town before winning the contract. This wasn't unique to the Arndale chain either. It became the standard playbook for redevelopment across the entire country. In Bootle near Liverpool, the Borough Council pursued what it explicitly called comprehensive redevelopment of the town centre through the mid-1960s, demolishing Strand Road and several adjoining streets to clear roughly 10 acres for what became the new Strand Shopping Centre, using compulsory purchase orders to assemble the site, despite considerable resident displacement. In Bristol, the council approved an even more ambitious scheme in the Eastern District, originally intended to radically transform around 200 acres of inner-city streets, using compulsory purchase powers passed by a council vote of 60 to 33, over the strong objections of councillors who argued that housing funds were being diverted toward what amounted to road building and car parking under a different name. In Edinburgh, the council pursued the St. James Centre, again relying on compulsory purchase to assemble the land needed. In Birmingham, the Bull Ring underwent comprehensive redevelopment, becoming one of the most cited early examples of the entire movement, opening in 1964 and inspiring planners across the country to attempt similar schemes in their own towns. Local pressure groups did exist, pushing back against the sheer scale of what was happening. One of them, known as Spur, campaigned specifically for a more balanced approach, one that weighed rehabilitation and genuine conservation against this wave of total demolition. But Spur's voice, however well argued, was consistently drowned out by the financial and political momentum already in motion. The largest of all these projects by a considerable margin was reserved for Manchester. Planning for it stretched back to wartime surveys conducted while bombs were still falling on British cities during the Second World War. Construction finally began in 1971, continuing in phases until 1979, at a cost of £100 million, an almost unthinkable sum for a single retail development at the time. To build it, the council and developers swept away what one council surveyor openly described as an area crystallized in its Victorian setting, in need of being, in his own words, systematically unraveled. Read that phrase again slowly. Unraveled. As though the city's own accumulated history was simply a knot to be untied and tossed aside without much further thought. What replaced it would divide opinion for the next 50 years, and arguably still does today. What rose on Market Street in Manchester was, by any measure, genuinely enormous. A vast indoor shopping centre, clad from top to bottom in ceramic tiles the colour of a colour nobody had actually asked for. Locals would later describe those tiles, quite memorably, and not at all kindly, as bile yellow. Inside there was a market hall, a bus station, parking for thousands of vehicles, and, almost as an afterthought, natural daylight kept deliberately to an absolute minimum. Because the developers genuinely believed shoppers spent more money once they lost all track of the time of day. It worked, financially, exactly as intended. It also became one of the most ridiculed buildings in the entire country almost from the moment it opened. Architecture critics tore into it relentlessly. One widely read book published in 1975 titled The Rape of Britain, written by Colin Amory and Dan Cruikshank, with a foreword contributed by the poet and broadcaster John Betjeman, used exactly that kind of unflinching language to describe what had happened. Not only in Manchester, but in roughly 20 British towns subjected to remarkably similar treatment across the preceding decade. The book described a mindset among certain planners that genuinely sincerely believed historic town centres ought to resemble, in their own words, a futuristic vision borrowed wholesale from radical modernist architecture, rather than anything resembling the actual place people had grown up calling home. This is the detail that tends to get completely lost in the retelling. The backlash wasn't some fringe complaint. It was a genuinely mainstream national reckoning. 1975 happened to be European Architectural Heritage Year, and Britain spent a considerable portion of it publicly mourning what it had only just finished tearing down with its own hands. The pressure group Save Britain's Heritage was formed that very same year, specifically to try to stop the next wave of demolition before it claimed even more towns. But here's the part that should really stop you in your tracks, if nothing else has so far. By the time that backlash reached its full national volume, it was already too late for the high streets that had been cleared years earlier. The shops were already gone. The families who had run them for generations had already scattered, taken their formula-based compensation, and either retired early, relocated entirely, or attempted to start again somewhere else, usually with far less success than they'd once enjoyed. You cannot undemolish a street once the rubble has been carted away. You can only argue loudly about it afterward, which is precisely, exactly what happened, for years on end. And just as that controversy was reaching its peak, something else hit. Something nobody sitting in a council planning office had ever budgeted for. In October of 1973, oil-producing nations imposed an embargo that sent fuel prices rocketing skyward and economies across the entire Western world into genuine shock. Britain, already wrestling with rising inflation and serious industrial unrest, was hit particularly hard. Property values, which had been climbing steadily throughout the boom years of redevelopment, suddenly went sharply into reverse. Major developers who had been mid-construction on ambitious new shopping schemes found their financing drying up almost overnight. Projects that had already demolished the old high street, but had not yet finished building its promised replacement, simply stopped. Frozen. Mid-air with no clear date for when or if work would ever resume. Picture that for a moment, because it's worth really sitting with the image. Entire town centers where the bulldozers had already finished their job, where Victorian shop fronts that had stood proudly for 100 years were now simply rubble, and where the gleaming new shopping precinct that was supposed to replace them existed only as a half-built concrete shell, fenced off, slowly gathering weeds and graffiti. This wasn't a one-off tragedy confined to one unlucky town. It happened across the entire country, repeatedly. Planners had a grim, almost clinical name for it: planning blight. Land that sat derelict, half cleared, half built, for not months but years. In some documented cases, considerably more than a decade passed before anything further happened on the site at all. If you want to genuinely understand why so many British town centres still feel slightly wrong today, slightly mismatched, like two entirely different decades stitched together with the seams left visible, this is a huge part of the answer. The property crash that ran from roughly 1974 through 1976 didn't just slow down redevelopment schemes. It froze entire towns halfway through their own surgery, with the patient left lying open on the table for years. And just to make sure nobody walked away from this particular era with too much residual faith in the people running it, there was one more scandal waiting to surface, and it directly involved one of the very architects responsible for these schemes. That architect, John Paulson, the same man behind the original Leeds Arndale Centre, had been involved in several similar redevelopment projects throughout the 1960s. Paulson's name would eventually become shorthand for something far darker than merely ambitious town planning. He was investigated, prosecuted, and ultimately imprisoned for corruption, for systematically paying local politicians and council officials to fast-track his projects against the wider public interest. The scandal that followed forced genuine changes in planning law and left an entire generation deeply, understandably suspicious of any council that claimed redevelopment was simply, purely about progress. Meanwhile, ordinary shoppers were absorbing a separate series of shocks that, taken together with the physical demolition happening around them, made this entire period feel like the ground itself was shifting beneath their feet. On Monday, the 15th of February, 1971, known ever after as Decimal Day, Britain abandoned its centuries-old system of pounds, shillings and pence in favor of decimal currency. Every till in every shop on every high street had to be converted. Every member of staff had to be retrained from scratch. Surveys conducted at the time found widespread public confusion and suspicion, with many shoppers convinced, not without reason, that retailers were quietly rounding prices upward during the changeover and pocketing the difference. 2 years later, on the 1st of April 1973, the government introduced an entirely new tax called value-added tax, replacing the old purchase tax as a condition of Britain's recent entry into the European Economic Community. Every small shopkeeper, already grappling with rising rents and the looming threat of redevelopment, now had to learn an entirely new system of taxation almost overnight. So let's pause here and add this up honestly, because this is the moment the whole story actually clicks firmly into place. A government traffic report, intended purely to manage congestion, became a convenient justification for wholesale demolition. Institutional money, channeled through one of the country's largest insurance companies, financed the clearance of historic town centers at a scale no single high street shop could ever hope to resist on its own. Councils used compulsory purchase to remove families who had traded successfully on the very same corner for 2 or 3 generations. Critics, architects, and ordinary residents revolted, publicly and furiously, but largely only after the damage was already irreversible. An oil crisis halfway around the world then froze dozens of these half-finished projects in mid-construction, leaving British towns visibly scarred for years afterward. And on top of all of it, shopkeepers were simultaneously forced to absorb a brand new currency system and a brand new tax, both within roughly 2 years of each other. This is the part that nobody puts into a nostalgic montage of red telephone boxes and rattling milk floats. The high street wasn't quietly overtaken by changing times, drifting gently into irrelevance. It was taken apart, piece by piece on purpose, by people who genuinely believed, often quite sincerely, that they were building something better, backed by money that had every financial incentive in the world to agree enthusiastically with them. But what happened to the actual people who had run those original shops? The men and women standing behind the counters when the compulsory purchase notice landed on their doormat. That's where this story stops being about architecture and concrete, and starts being deeply, uncomfortably personal. Before we go further, if you've made it this far into the video, do me one small favor. Hit subscribe, because Britwave covers exactly this kind of story every single week. The real history behind the Britain that everyone remembers fondly but almost nobody fully explains. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me one specific thing your own town centre lost during this era. A shop, a market, a particular building nobody seems to talk about anymore. I genuinely read every comment, and some of the best research leads for future videos come directly from people sharing exactly this kind of memory. If this is the kind of history you want more of, give the video a like, and if you know someone who watched their own high street change beyond recognition growing up, send this their way. They'll understand precisely what we're talking about. Probably better than most. Now, back to the people behind the shop counters, because their story is genuinely where this whole thing stops being abstract policy and starts being personal. When a council issued a compulsory purchase order, it wasn't dealing with faceless property on a planning map. It was dealing with someone's entire working life, often someone's entire identity within their own community. Independent shopkeepers in Britain at this time typically didn't own sprawling business empires spread across multiple locations. They owned one shop, sometimes 2 at most, often inherited directly from a parent or grandparent, who had spent decades carefully building up a loyal customer base through nothing more than consistency, fairness, and personal attention. Compensation was calculated according to fairly rigid government formulas, based on the assessed value of the property and a notional figure for disturbance to the business, not on what that shop genuinely meant to the family who had run it, and certainly not on what it would actually cost to rebuild that exact same level of trust and custom somewhere else entirely from scratch. Many shopkeepers simply couldn't afford the new rents demanded in the gleaming shopping centers that replaced their old familiar premises. The underlying economics had shifted entirely beneath their feet. Arndale-style developments were specifically designed for large chain retailers with national buying power, predictable footfall projections, and head offices able to absorb a difficult year or two while a brand new center slowly established itself in the public's habits. A single butcher or greengrocer, the kind of small business that had somehow survived 2 world wars, rationing, and the Great Depression before that, often simply couldn't compete on those particular financial terms. Some retired earlier than planned, their life savings tied up in compensation payments that didn't stretch nearly as far as expected, once the inflation of the mid-1970s began rapidly, eating away at the real value of money itself. Inflation in Britain during that period reached levels that genuinely alarmed economists, with prices for everyday goods climbing at a pace that made any fixed lump sum payout shrink dramatically within just a few short years. Others tried bravely to start again in smaller premises on the edges of town, in locations carrying only a fraction of the footfall they had spent a lifetime building up. This is where the story takes its sharpest, most genuinely uncomfortable turn. Because decades later, the very same shopping centers that had replaced the high street, the Arndales and their many imitators scattered across the country, began suffering an almost identical fate to the one they themselves had originally inflicted. By the early 2000s, several of the original Arndale centers were already being rebranded, quietly sold off, or in some cases demolished entirely in their own turn. The Doncaster Arndale became the French Gate Centre following redevelopment in the late 1980s. Blackburn's Arndale House was demolished outright in 2008. Bolton's eventually became something else entirely, renamed and reworked, before facing demolition pressures of its own a few years later. The very same justification once used to confidently flatten Victorian high streets, namely that the old structures were obsolete and no longer fit for modern retail life, was now being applied, almost word for word, to the very buildings that had replaced them barely 30 or 40 years earlier. Sit with that uncomfortable irony for just a second. They were wrong. Not because progress itself is always inherently wrong. It isn't. But because they fundamentally mistook permanence for the wrong thing entirely. They assumed concrete and steel and covered malls would naturally outlast crumbling Victorian brick, simply by virtue of being newer and more modern. Instead, it was the human relationships woven into those old high streets, the kind of social fabric no architect can ever truly design directly into a building no matter how skilled they are, that turned out to be the thing genuinely worth preserving all along. If you walk through certain British towns today, you can still see the seam where one era ends and another begins. The slightly too wide road that used to be a row of densely packed shop fronts. The shopping center with the unmistakable 1970s bones wrapped uncomfortably in a much newer facade. The strange, awkward gap where something significant used to stand, now occupied by a chain coffee shop, whose staff know absolutely nothing about what came before them on that exact spot. And it's worth remembering, too, just how much genuine life used to happen in those lost spaces, beyond the simple business of buying and selling things. The high street wasn't only where you shopped. It was where news traveled before anyone had heard of television news bulletins reaching every home. It was where you found out, often within hours, who in the neighborhood was expecting a baby, who had passed away, who had come home safely from national service. The shopkeepers themselves often functioned as a kind of informal community network, long before anyone had coined a phrase for it. Lose the shop, and you don't just lose a place to buy bread. You lose an entire quiet, unglamorous information system that had served working class and middle class communities alike for generations, without anyone ever really noticing how essential it had become. Multiply that loss across the roughly 20 towns specifically named in the Rape of Britain, and then multiply it again across the dozens upon dozens of additional towns that pursued similar comprehensive redevelopment schemes without ever making it into that particular book, and you begin to grasp the genuine, almost staggering scale of what changed within a single generation. This wasn't a handful of isolated, unfortunate incidents. It was a coordinated nationwide pattern, repeated with remarkable consistency, from Jarrow in the northeast, to Bristol in the southwest, to Edinburgh well north of the border, to Birmingham sitting squarely in the heart of England. And the truly painful irony, the detail that makes this story worth telling honestly rather than just nostalgically, is that so much of it was genuinely avoidable. Buchanan's actual report, read carefully and in full rather than skimmed for headlines, had explicitly warned against exactly this kind of indiscriminate, wholesale demolition. It was the interpretation, the financial incentives layered on top, and the sheer institutional momentum behind men like Hagenbach and Chippendale that turned a cautious traffic study into a nationwide demolition program nobody had ever explicitly voted for. So if you take just one thing away from everything we've covered today, let it be this. The next time someone confidently tells you the high street died purely because of Amazon, purely because of online shopping, purely because shoppers simply got lazy or times simply changed on their own, you'll know better than that now. You'll know that the first and arguably the deepest wound of all was inflicted decades earlier by people in suits sitting in council chambers, armed with a traffic report and someone else's institutional money, genuinely convinced they were saving the very thing they were, in practice, actively destroying piece by piece. That's not a comfortable story to tell, and it certainly doesn't fit neatly into a gentle nostalgic montage of red telephone boxes and bunting strung across a quaint street. But it happens to be the truth, and the truth matters considerably more than comfort, especially when it comes to genuinely understanding how the towns we grew up in came to look the way they do today. If your own town went through something resembling this, if there's a shopping center near you carrying a name you've heard whispered with a slight, knowing roll of the eyes, you now know roughly how it got there, who actually paid for it, and precisely what it replaced. That knowledge doesn't bring back the old high street, of course. Nothing realistically will. But it does mean you're no longer looking at these buildings the same way most people still do, as simply how things have always been around here. You now know they were a choice. A deliberate, heavily financed, occasionally outright corrupt choice, made by people who never once had to live with the daily consequences the way the families on those original high streets eventually did. That's the real story sitting quietly behind the photographs you've probably scrolled past 100 times without a second thought. The ones showing striped awnings and cobbled streets and proud shopkeepers in clean white aprons standing outside their own front door. Those weren't simply pretty pictures of a simpler, slower time. They were honest evidence of something that got carefully taken apart, piece by piece, in the sincere name of a progress that, in the end, didn't even manage to outlast the very thing it had so confidently replaced. If this kind of deep dive into the real, researched history behind British everyday life is something you genuinely want more of, make sure you're subscribed, because there's plenty more of exactly this coming soon. Drop a comment and tell me what you personally remember, or what your own parents and grandparents once told you about your town centre before it changed forever. Give this video a like if it gave you a different way of looking at something you thought you already fully understood, and share it with someone who'll genuinely appreciate knowing the real story behind it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.